Professor Miles Kimball is the Eugene B. Eaton Jr. Chair and Endowed Chair in Economics. So I should say something a little bit about Eugene Eaton. So he was one of our, he got his undergraduate degree in economics and his PhD in economics. And it just so happened his mother was, I believe, the department secretary in the economics department. And so when he requested $6.5 million to the university, he created this chair and another big program for undergraduate economics students. So I want to recognize him and his generosity in the university and our department for doing that. But let me talk about Miles. We just hired Miles into this position in September. And he received his undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard in 1982. Then, I don't know, he got off the rails for a short time, and he got a master's in linguistics at Brigham Young University. I didn't know that, but I'd forgotten the story behind it. And then in 1987, he received his PhD in economics from Harvard. He joined the University of Michigan faculty and then stayed there until he joined us this year. And he was a professor there. He's also, since 1999, been a research professor in the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. So Miles led our writers when he applied for our job. One of them was the Nobel laureate in economics, Angus Deaton, and he talked about his pioneering work. And I'll just tell you the topics that he's famous for. Topics on precautionary savings, risk aversion, time preference, and intertemporal substitution. That's a second topic. And the economics of happiness and utility. And recently, he's one of the world experts on negative interest rates. And so he's gone all over the world lecturing on negative interest rates lately. And so we're really pleased to have Miles. One of the things I would say personally about him is, having gone through a lot of work, bringing him here and negotiating and getting him to come, he's really a delightful person, and he's a very positive guy. And in the dismal profession, it's kind of a small set. It's kind of a small set. So I really enjoyed him joining our faculty, and we're delighted to have him. And he's going to be talking about restoring American growth, and I really don't have any idea what he's going to say.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. And I should say, if it is true that only a small fraction of economists are positive people, a large share of them are in this department, because I have very, very nice colleagues and actually wonderful students as well. Okay, so this is the outline. I'm going to talk about big problems in the scope of economics. I'm going to get you worried first, and then we'll talk about problems that look hard but have a good solution, and then approaches to tough problems of restoring long-run growth. Those really are tough problems, and there are lots of questions here. I'm not sure I know how to do this, so I'm going to tell you about my thinking about it. Here are the three ideas that I have for restoring long-run growth that I'll talk about in more detail: allow creative destruction, dismantle privilege standing in the way of growth, and supporting science. And this, of course, is going to be the most controversial, because I'll bet one of the privileges is one that you have. So give me a little leeway here. I'm going to argue these privileges stand in the way of growth, and that's part of what we need to do. But if I get if I get run out on a rail, it'll be for this section here. Okay. So economics is actually much broader than people realize sometimes. And so in one of the meetings I came in on just a little bit, Nick was talking about how, for people interested in human rights, there are really a lot of things that economics deals with. It studies immigration. Is it really true that immigrants hurt the people who were born in America? How can we help countries that are poor get richer? What difference does it make to a country if the women are empowered? Those are all really big topics in economics. One of the other things that leads to economics being much broader than people realize is economists are statisticians. So where many other fields use statistics, actually econometrics, which is the name for the statistics as it's used in economics, is a branch of statistics. And from the very beginning, econometricians have been at the research frontier along with other statisticians. And so economists are really, both the econometricians who develop new techniques, but also all the economists who use the techniques, they use them at a very high level. And the kind of statistics we use in economics, that is econometrics, is statistics for dealing with messy situations like we have in the social sciences. And so if you have a social science question that a statistical answer can help with, often an economist can be very, very helpful there. And so I've argued quite strongly on my blog here. I'll mention my blog from various different angles, and here's some names of some of the blog posts if you want to look them up, that economics should be this broad, that basically there are so many important questions in the social sciences that we need people to be coming at them from different angles, and to the extent a question can benefit from a very heavy-duty statistical treatment, we ought to have economists on the question. And so we don't want to have monopolies of, you know, oh, only sociologists are allowed to answer these questions, only political scientists are allowed to answer these questions. You really want an interdisciplinary approach. And in that interdisciplinary approach to the big social science questions, I think, although there are definitely other social scientists who are very good at statistics, I think economists typically can bring some statistical firepower to the questions. And so I think that's very important. And it's been evolving in economics. This has been getting more and more over time. Economists have been really addressing a very wide range of questions. Now, more recently, in addition to the social sciences, economists have actually been dealing with questions that are a little ways into the biological questions too. So first of all, my friend and co-author Dan Benjamin has been involved especially in looking at genetic issues. And they recently have been developing the kind of best genetic predictor they could come up with based on a sample of 70,000 people for whether somebody is likely to get a lot of education or not. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those gene approaches lately, but that's right now I'm just talking about the breadth of this as economics, and I'll talk a little bit later on about the question of, you know, I think one of the first-class mysteries in science, incredibly important, is why obesity has been going up, not just in the US, but across the world. And this is a question that's so important and so tricky. So tricky. We know it's tricky because if it weren't tricky, we'd all know how to deal with it. We'd all know the approaches to, you know, losing weight permanently. But it's clear that this question is so tricky that there isn't a consensus about how to do that successfully. Lots of people with claims, not a consensus. But I think I'm going to argue that too is an area where economists can be part of the teams who are looking for answers. So let's now dig into some problems. I'm going to show you some graphs that I hope will scare you, actually, or at least worry you. So there's been a lot of talk about inequality. I want to give you a slightly different dimension of inequality. Here's inequality of happiness. So if you look at the top 20% of the population and income, those folks actually are getting happier. The next 20% are getting happier here, but the bottom 20%, their happiness seemed to be going down. At least this is actually work by a former student of mine, Jean-Benoît Rousseau. The bottom 20% have been getting less happy, and you know, the next 20% and the middle 20% have also been getting less happy. And I think we've seen some of the reverberations of that in things that have happened in politics lately. I mean, I think looking at cutting the data in different ways, you see that there's why there might be some discontent out there. Here's another reflection of discontent, really. It shows that something is going wrong. So so what's in this graph? So we have that red line is mortality for white Americans, and it comes from a paper by Ann Case and Angus Eaton. So Angus Eaton is a friend of mine that you heard Nick talk about briefly. He won a Nobel Prize recently, and actually folks outside academia may not realize how remarkable it was that he won a Nobel Prize all by himself. Typically economists win it in groups of threes, but he's quite an amazing person. And so Ann Case and Angus Eaton looked at white mortality in the US, which is going up, but look, in all these other countries, mortality's been going down, and in the US, Hispanic mortality has also been going down. So this is something going wrong with people in the 45 to 54-year bracket of whites. Now, one piece of what's going on that Ann Case and Angus Eaton emphasize is the opioid epidemic. That's some piece of the puzzle. Here's another graph of the mortality rates. So you see black mortality is way higher than white mortality. But if you look just at European Americans who have a high school education or less, their mortality is now higher than black mortality. Okay, so there are lots of people that have problems, but among the many groups that have problems, European Americans who have a high school education or less are looking kind of bad when we look at the mortality statistics. Okay? And notice the Hispanics have lower mortality than whites as a whole, so there are things you learn by looking at the data that you might not have known before. Okay, let's talk a little bit about obesity. I just want to give credit to the article that I'm drawing these graphs from. It's an article called 5 Myths About American Obesity. And one of the myths is that folks with a college education are immune. You can see everybody's going up. Folks with a college education have lower body mass indexes. I don't know if you know the scale for body mass index, but 25 is pretty healthy. They say above 25, they start calling you overweight. Above 30, they call you obese. So typically, it's a little more complicated than that, but that gives you some idea of the scale. So each group is increasing in weight. So and this is a mystery. This is a mystery. There are many people who will tell you they know the answer, but in fact, as I said, this is a big scientific mystery that deserves much more research. What about Colorado? Well, one of the things I noticed was in Colorado, everybody looks so fit, and they clearly weigh less than folks elsewhere. It's pretty obvious, but unfortunately, the trend lines don't look so good. So although Colorado is in better shape than California, and of course Mississippi is in worse shape than California, each of these states, there's a trend line to greater obesity. And this isn't just a cosmetic thing, although the cosmetic aspect is huge. The amount of brain space, the amount of consciousness devoted to worrying about weight in America is a huge, huge cost. I mean, this is there in many, many people's minds, and that alone is a huge cost, but it also adds to disease and mortality. It's a big deal. It's not just the US. Look at that. Lots of different countries, the trend lines are all up, and we don't understand this. This is where we need science. And it's not obviously from people being sedentary and not getting enough exercise, because exercise is actually increased. So I want to put that up there just to press home this point that it's a mystery. You might think the answer is obvious. Now, one of the interesting candidates is sugar consumption, which indeed has been going up a lot. So look, there's overall kind of consumption of sugars. You have had a decrease lately in cane and beet sugar, but then there was a big increase in corn sweeteners. Then lately the corn sweeteners have come down some. That's the high fructose corn syrup to a great degree. So maybe that's part of the story. We honestly don't know, and we should know the answer. It's too bad that we don't know the answer. Now, shifting gears a little bit, foreign policy has been in the news a lot, and in particular, kind of military issues. One of the things I worry about is what's going to happen to the world when China becomes the greatest superpower in the world, and why might that happen? Well, per capita GDP in China, this is from one of my blog posts, you can see the title there, Benjamin Franklin's strategy to make US a superpower worked once, why not try it again? In this graph, you can see the ratio of China's per capita GDP, their standard of living compared to the US. It's now about 15% of the per capita GDP of the US, the income per person. But if you look at populations, the US only has about 22% the number of people that China does. So when this number gets bigger than that number, the total GDP of China matters. Now, for most purposes, we care about income per capita, but there's one thing for which total gross domestic product matters, and that's military power. And so China's economy may soon exceed the size of the US. What can we do about it? There are basically two things we can do about it. One of them is to raise our per capita GDP, because then the resources out of which we draw our military power are going to be greater. I'll be talking about what I think can be done along those lines. But there's one other obvious thing, and that's to increase our population. And honestly, there's an easy way to increase our population. We have many, many people begging to get into the United States, and many of them could be very good citizens especially if we had, we could enhance our programs for helping people assimilate and become very devoted American citizens. But one way or another, it could help in terms of our power on the world stage if there were more Americans. I mean, I think of it this way as I think it's great to be an American. I think we should get more Americans. And if we had more Americans, we'd make the world a better place. And guess what? It's pretty easy to get more Americans. All we have to do is let them in and then help them to learn the ropes. Okay. So now we're going to get into a bit more traditional kind of economic issue of looking at economic growth. And the next few slides I'm going to take from a paper by my co-author, John Fernald, actually using, he uses some of the techniques we've developed in joint papers, but this particular paper is totally his. He's talking about what's happened to productivity before the Great Recession, during, and after. And here's the basic story. So unfortunately, he left off what happened before here. So this is a measure of productivity on the vertical axis, and then you see the years here. Before 1973, productivity was growing quite fast. Some people have called it the golden age of productivity growth. Now, you got to take that with a little grain of salt, because productivity is higher than it's ever been before. So it's only when you focus on rate of improvement that back in the 60s was a golden age. But people do feel good about improvement, even if today we have a very high level of productivity. People would feel better if it were improving still faster. Anyway, there was a period back here when productivity increased quite fast, in fact, remarkably fast from a historical point of view. Things slowed down in 73. There were a lot of political ramifications of that. Basically, and it wasn't just the US, it was all across the world. I read a book recently about this era, and just there was political tumult in lots of different places in the world. People throw the people out of power, things aren't working well, but a lot of it was just productivity wasn't growing. And we don't really understand why productivity slowed down. Some people say, oh, it was the energy crisis, but I actually don't think that's an adequate explanation. I mean, it's mostly this is a mystery too. Then from 95 to 2003, there was a speed up of productivity growth. this was the recent period when things improved rapidly. And so, presidents get both credit and blame for the economic situation way more than they deserve. A lot of most of what's happening economically has to do with much more dispersed things. And when presidents do things that are going to help with long-run growth, it often shows up in good things happening after they're out of office. And so, for example, the much maligned Jimmy Carter started down the road of some of the better dimensions of deregulation, and but that it only showed up in good things happening after he was gone. But anyway, we had this speed up, and part of the story here was you had computers coming in, and computers totally transformed retail and supply chains during this period of time. That's not the whole story, but that's a big part of the story. And so one of the things I'm going to emphasize later on too is to get good aggregate productivity growth statistics, for us to be getting better at doing things. And this feeds in a lot to incomes going up and things feeling better. In order to get good statistics like this, you really have to be transforming some big sector of the economy. It's very difficult to get growth statistics that big without something quite dramatic. And in this case, it was like in retail and supply chains. And some other countries that wanted to protect the stores that they already had delayed this period of fast growth. So many places in Europe, for example, were, didn't want to have that, we're worried about this some of the transition was like to big box stores, for example, and folks in Europe didn't want that, and so they didn't get the growth quite as quickly as in the US. But, when the transformation is happening, you need to not block it or you're going to get some of your growth delayed. Then the last part of the story, and this is what John Fernald's paper is primarily about, is since 2003, the rate of productivity growth has slowed down again. And this is separate from the Great Recession. The Great Recession was a problem on top of this, but even if we hadn't had the Great Recession, the slower productivity growth would have been important and made things look less good, less satisfying to us. Okay, here's another graph that I constructed from data on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis's site, which is actually a wonderful site. If you want economic data, you just go literally type into your search box Fred, and then you'll see it come up, and there's tons of wonderful data. Okay, so this is the growth rate of labor productivity in the 5 years after this, and what you can see is what I was saying before: quite fast productivity growth up until 73. Then from 73, for a while we had fairly low productivity growth in terms of, by productivity here, we're thinking of the simple thing of just output per worker hour. What's output per hour and the growth rate of that. And then here's this burst of faster growth in output per hour here, and then we've come back. So John Fernald's story is we've just come back to normal. His view is that this and this are what are unusual. And in the broad sweep of history, he's right about that. The Industrial Revolution, probably a little lower than this, but it's a whole lot more like this than it is like this. The Industrial Revolution was more like a productivity growth rate of 1% a year. So, and yet, in 70 years, that transformed everything. So we got used to high speeds, and now we're back to the slow speeds. But I want you to appreciate that even the slow speeds are like Industrial Revolution speed. This is still, the world is transforming, it's changing, things are getting better, at least in the economic sense and in the narrow economic sense, but we've come back to normal. So is there a way to get a little closer to some of these faster speeds, at least for a while, and push ahead with economic growth. Okay, this is now, I won't dwell on this, but the main point here is that in terms of growth in output per worker hour, it's really mostly technology. And we mean technology in a very broad sense. Any way of doing things better in economics is considered a technology. If you can figure out a better way to do things, that's a better technology. The other two things that can improve output per worker hour are how much you've invested in machines and factories, and now software is counted in investment, and then how much education people have. Okay, so those matter as well. But you can see the big thing that changed was technology improved very fast in this period. Technology improved slower. The way of doing things improved fast here. And then now our ways of doing things aren't improving as fast anymore. Okay. Now, let's try to break things down a little bit to do a bit more of a diagnosis. Where's the problem? Well, guess what? In terms of your classic factory, that's still improving quite rapidly. We're getting better and better at doing manufacturing. And so you might say, wow, but I've heard all these problems in manufacturing. But the analogy is it's like agriculture. We got better and better at doing agriculture. What did it do when we got better and better at doing agriculture? We didn't need as many farmers to feed everybody. I suppose we could have tried to eat more and more and more, but you know, and we do to some extent eat higher and higher quality food, but still, even with eating higher quality food, it still doesn't take that many farmers to feed us all. And so you get a big increase in agricultural output, but you don't need as many farmers anymore. Manufacturing's the same. Manufacturing is a huge success in terms of productivity. It's a huge success in terms of output and providing us with many things. But like farming, it doesn't take very many people to do it anymore. And there's really not much way around this. We're not going to see a return to the era of lots and lots of factories. And I say that in a worldwide scope. You know, this is happening in the whole world. So I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but I need to keep this picture up to show you some other things. So in terms of producing durable equipment, we've been getting a lot better. Non-durable consumption, not so much improvement. And look at how miserable the improvement in productivity. In fact, almost no improvement in productivity measured in the statistics for construction, for building things. And although the statistics might not include all of the quality improvements, so you could argue that this isn't fully accurate, I think it gives you the main picture right. We're building buildings in a very similar way to the way we built buildings 50 years ago. Think of that in comparison to computers, what's going on in factories with robots and everything. There's a much greater similarity between how we used to build buildings and how we build buildings now, and you know, what we did in factories 50 years ago and what we do in factories now. And I don't know why this is. Why haven't we improved more in construction? That's part of that's a partial diagnosis. Something is going wrong in the construction industry, okay? So it's not the whole problem. It's not, you know, it's not everything that's going on, but it's absolutely worth thinking about. We ought to be actually throwing more economists at studying the construction industry to see what's going on. Okay, now this is what I was alluding to a minute ago. Agriculture went down. Here's manufacturing. Manufacturing went up as a fraction of gross domestic product up until 1910 or so, and then it's been coming down since then. It's going the way of agriculture. In other words, very productive. We get lots of stuff, but it just doesn't take that many people to do it. Okay? That's true in the whole world. Employment in manufacturing as a percentage of total employment is going down. Now, it is true that the US has kind of led the pack in the decline in manufacturing, but look, everybody else is coming the same direction. So it's a worldwide thing. Because we're so good at making manufactured goods, we just don't need as many stuff. So what's not going to be possible without giving up that extra productivity in manufactured goods is to get as many people jobs doing those traditional factory jobs as before. And there's a bit of a problem in our economics teaching. We still talk about people making widgets in factories, and that doesn't really represent very well what's going on anymore. So here's a pie chart showing by shares of value added the output of different sectors. And here's manufacturing, those two slices. There's construction. You got some mining and utilities. Well, what's the rest? Well, wholesale and retail trade. Look, wholesale and retail trade are about as big as manufacturing. Then you've, it's more if I include transportation and warehousing. There's information goods, that's 4.8%. Finance and insurance by itself is 6.6%. Then look at this, real estate and rental and leasing, that's pretty big. Here's us, professional, scientific, and technical services there. Actually, yeah. Oh, I don't know whether, well, part of our time we're educational services, part of our time we're scientific services. So management, administrative, arts, entertainment, and recreation are small slice. And then you have some government pieces. Now, you've got some, somewhere here there's medical, but whatever the medical, let's see, where did it go? I think some of the medical is inside the government. Some of the medical is actually inside the government, but here's healthcare and social assistance, 7.1%. But so sometimes people say, you know, manufacturing is going down and as a fraction of GDP and services going up, but I want you to see just how many different things are under this category of services. It's not going to give you a good picture of the economy to say, oh, services are going up, because maybe it's just me, but when I think services, I think barbers. Well, guess where barbers are? They're in the other services here. They're in that little slice. So services are not barbers. You can see the things that services are. I mean, actually, if you had to say one big category, think folks in stores. You know, that's kind of a bigger category of storekeepers of some version or another, are a much bigger category of services than barbers. But calling it services hides more than it reveals. Okay, so I just love this pie chart because that gives you a better picture of the economy than, you know, a lot of other things. Okay, so now I want to focus a little bit more on the households, and mostly I'm going to make a simple point that housing is a big deal for households. If we can't get people cheaper housing, we're failing at something important to people. How important? 41% important. That's 41% of the household budget that goes to housing, and that's on average. My daughter lives in San Francisco. I can tell you it's more than 41% there. Okay, this is so important. I have several slides saying the same thing. Rent and mortgages there. I mean, these are calculated in different ways and maybe at different times. So, but the point is rent and mortgages is a big deal. Now there's some other things that are pretty big. Cars are pretty big. Cars and transportation are pretty big. That's 5.7% for cars. Public transport is 1.2%. Car parts, 1.6% in gasoline. So transportation's a fairly big deal. Utilities are 5.4%. So, you know, and then there's a lot of stuff, furniture, 4.1%. You know, food is not unimportant, but we've been doing pretty well at getting people cheap food, much less well at getting people inexpensive housing. Same thing over again. Again, housing, huge. That's this blue. So if we want to restore American growth, if we can do better on housing, that's going to help a lot. So let me now get a little bit technical by saying the following. So I have my students in intermediate macro actually do the calculations here, but basically whatever you improve at, suppose you improve your productivity in one of these areas, you then have to multiply by the percentage that that area is. So if something is a tiny little slice, you can get a lot better at it, and it's not going to make the overall picture that much better. So, you know, we saw in a minute ago how big a slice manufacturing is. We could get a lot better at manufacturing, and it's still only going to add a modest amount to economic growth because manufacturing just isn't that big a part of the picture. But if we could get better at building houses and otherwise providing cheaper accommodation for people, that would be worth a whole lot because that's 40% of their budget. Okay? So, you know, when they do the, if you do price indices, one of the nice ways to do price indices is you basically just take these fractions here and multiply them times the price changes in the different areas. So if you can get the prices to go down of something that's a big chunk, that's worth a lot more than if you can get the price to go down of something that's a small chunk. And so one of the things is, unless it's something that we want a lot more of, as we get better and better in doing something, then its share of the whole, because it gets cheaper, its share of the whole budget goes down, and then further improvements aren't going to help people make ends meet quite as much anymore. So there's a sense in which success means, okay, great, that problem of making manufactured stuff, it's getting more and more nearly solved. I mean, we still got a ways to go, but it's more and more nearly solved. You basically have to tackle the tough problems. If you keep tackling the problems you've been doing well at, you don't get as much extra mileage as if you can tackle some of the tough problems that you've been leaving to the side as too tough. Okay, now I'm switching to the section of problems that may look hard, but that aren't, that do have fairly straightforward solutions before we come back to the tough stuff. So Great Recession was a big, big deal, but I think we could have gotten out of it much sooner. Now, this red line is John Fernald's best estimate of how we would have done without the Great Recession. Unfortunately, because of the slowdown in productivity growth, we couldn't have kept going down along this line, but we could have done this one. This is what we actually did down here. So that loss was because of problems in macroeconomic policy. And I want to argue, I want to view it from the point of view of monetary policy. So monetary policy is normally quite powerful in stopping recessions. And since 1985, when we kind of figured out some of the basics of monetary policy, we had the great inflation, we figured out how to deal with that. From 85 to 2007 or so, the economy didn't, you didn't have terrible recessions for very long. You didn't have big booms. Things were on a reasonably steady keel. In fact, monetary policy seemed to do such a good job from 1985 to 2008 that period was called the Great Moderation. But then something went haywire with monetary policy in 2009. And what went wrong? The big problem was that the Fed and the other central banks made the mistake of thinking zero was as low as they could take interest rates. Now, and here you can see they're acting like zero is as low as they can go. Now, in very recent years, some countries have gone to negative rates, but up through 2015, they still were all zero or higher. So they were treating that as if that were a floor on rates, and we've seen with subsequent events with Switzerland and Sweden and the Eurozone and Japan going to negative rates that you can go to lower rates. It matters because typically you've got to take interest rates down by 5 percentage points to stop a recession pretty well. And there's been this general decline in interest rates, partly because inflation has been conquered to an important extent, but partly because the overall average real interest rates have been drifting downwards for a variety of reasons. So when you get closer to zero, now it's hard for you to get your normal 5 percentage point drop in interest rates unless you go to negative interest rates. And so we just need that for stabilizing recessions. And this is an area that I've been very interested in. So just set of resources. I've got 2 papers written, 1 paper in the works. I also regularly write about this on my blog, so much that I had to make a bibliography online. So this is my online bibliography of everything I've done on negative interest rates. So if you're interested, dive in there. But I argue it's quite possible by changing paper currency policies. You have to do something about the way we handle paper currency, and I won't go into the details. But if you do that, you can have interest rates as low as need be to stabilize the economy. You don't need fiscal policy. You can do it even if it's a terrible shock to the economy. I think that the business cycle is something that we can stabilize. So that's a problem that I believe has a solution, and the solution involves the negative interest rates. Now, switching gears to another big problem that I think has a very promising solution. You know, people are starting to notice with interest rates coming back up again that the cost of interest in adding to the national debt is getting pretty high. You know, when interest rates were close to 0, the national debt didn't seem such a big problem. Now people are starting to worry again. And they should worry for a simple reason. We're living a long time. Because we're living a long time, there are going to be a lot more Americans getting Social Security checks and having their medical care paid for by Medicare. And this is pretty easy to make some estimates, but basically analysts have known for a long time that there's going to be a huge bulge in the amount of money that the government is committed to paying, or most people think it's committed to paying for the medical care and the Social Security checks of older Americans. And so how are we going to keep the national debt from getting too big? You know, because we didn't use monetary policy to solve the Great Recession as early as we should have, we actually ran up a lot of debt fighting the Great Recession with fiscal policy instead of the monetary policy, which would have not run up our debt. But even bigger deal is we have the aging of the graying of America. So this is a picture of a page on my blog. You can see the title, Confessions of a Supply-Side Liberal. So you know, choosing that name, it was a bit of a commitment to try to think of ways, wow, how am I going to solve problems like this? And how can we deal with these? And so here's the suggestion I have here. And you can see I haven't written as much as on negative interest rates, but I've written quite a few things. The bibliographic post is called How and Why to Expand the Nonprofit Sector as a Partial Alternative to Government. And I want to emphasize partial alternative to government. But the idea is instead of raising taxes to try to close the budget deficit off in the future, not very far in the future, what I want to do is in a way I'm going to raise taxes, but I want us to say, look, you can avoid every bit of those extra taxes if you donate it to charity instead. So it's 100% tax credit for those extra taxes. So you have call it a tax surcharge if you want. But the tax surcharge isn't meant to be paid to the government. That's only a backstop to encourage people to donate more to charity. And I have a long list of reasons here for why there are reasons to think that that might be a good approach. I mean, there are things that can be done more deftly by the nonprofit sector than government. The nonprofit sector isn't perfect, but we have developed a set of procedures for dealing with the bad actors in the nonprofit sector, so we kind of know what the issues are there. Let me just read some of these things here quickly. Because the nonprofit sector is more decentralized, it involves a more diverse body of key decision makers, and so can be more creative than government. In the nonprofit sector, it's easier to sunset programs that don't work well than in government, because people can just stop donating to them. Nonprofit sector provision of public goods tends to be cheaper, since wages in the nonprofit sector tend to be lower than the private for-profit sector. while government wages tend to be higher than the private for-profit sector. 4, even if giving to some charity is required, giving to a charity of one's choice is much more fun than forking over taxes to the government. You know, economists worry about the distortions from taxes. Where do the distortions come from taxation? It comes from people trying to avoid paying taxes. Why do people not want to pay taxes? Actually, it's a better question than you might think. And here's my view. Paying taxes, they don't just take money out of your pocket. They take your dignity, they take your pride, they take your power. They're taking all kinds of things from you when they take your taxes. If the government is simply saying, look, you got to give a certain amount to charity, they have taken money out of your pocket, in a sense. They forced you to give away money. They haven't taken your power, because you can choose what to donate to. They haven't taken your dignity. You'll have people in the nonprofit sector who will treat you well for those donations. In fact, enough so you'll have to have rules to keep them from treating you too well from donating to them, lest the money all be dissipated. But so therefore, because people won't hate giving the money away to charity as much, they won't do all the destructive things that people do in order to avoid taxes quite as much in order to avoid giving to charity. 5, I really believe that people will become more altruistic. In the religion I grew up in, they definitely had the idea that if you serve people, you will love them more. You know, if you give money, if you help people out, you want to think, oh, it's not. You could think, oh, the government's forcing me to do this. That's an option. More likely, you'll take the option, hey, I'm a good person. I'm giving to charity. And you know what? If you think you're a good person because you're giving to charity, maybe you will become a better person. We don't know. This is an area where more research is needed, but it's a worthy hypothesis. And the last one I have is thinking about which charity to give to will help educate people about the issues surrounding helping folks. And you know, you need the government still to help unpopular groups, but there are a lot of groups that are very popular. You know, old folks are actually pretty popular. A lot of people like old folks, and I think that the nonprofits would get plenty of donations to take care of old folks, which, by the way, is where, as it is, most of the money from the government is going to have to go. So this is very relevant. So honestly, this is an idea I love. I'd love to have more discussion about it, but I do need to move on to other things. Let me just point out, my blog's pretty easy to find. If you Google my name, Miles Kimball, you will get to the mail order company. And I wish I owned a share of it, but no, despite having the same name, no relation. Then under the mail order company, you will very quickly come to me and my blog. And then if you get to my blog, there are these buttons that have key posts, negative rates. That's the list of resources about negative rates. This one will get you to talking about what I call the public contribution program, which I was just talking about. There's a little biography of me. This is where you start out. And then there's an archive that shows past posts. And then the search box is very useful. If you're interested in a topic, click on that search box, type in the word, see what I've written about it. Okay. Moving on to a different problem, avoiding another financial crisis. Now, notice I've already said, or implied, and it's true, even if we have another financial crisis, if we have good monetary policy that's willing to use negative interest rates, we can avoid a repeat of the Great Recession. Financial crises will still be painful, but they'd be over much quicker. We could have had this one over by mid-2010. Just with good monetary policy, despite the financial crisis, I believe. But suppose you don't want the financial crisis in the first place, which I think is a good choice. There's a simple answer: impose strict leverage limits. In particular, raise the capital conservation buffer dramatically. What does that mean? That means financial firms are not allowed to pay dividends or buy back stock unless their stockholders have enough skin in the game that if things went bad, the stockholders would take the hit, not the taxpayers. Okay? Some people have suggested that the government can simply promise not to bail out banks or other financial firms. I'm sorry, that sounds nice. It's not going to work. Why? That's actually a promise the government shouldn't keep in the event of a serious financial crisis, and so it's a promise that's not credible. Will the government shoot us all in the foot if we did have another financial crisis? Maybe. I worry about that, but I have my hopes that the government wouldn't shoot us in the foot, and if it doesn't, it's going to have to bail out the banks if you let it happen. Don't make the bailout necessary in the first place. Don't let the banks get away with it. To me, the moment you let banks and other financial firms have the really high leverage, that is the moment you've decided to do a bailout. It's right now we're deciding to do a bailout by letting these banks have huge leverage. Don't let them do it. And this is a very current issue because you know, there's a contest for the soul of President Trump on each policy issue, and who knows what he believes about the leverage of financial firms, but it could go either way. Okay, so you know, make sure financial firms won't need a bailout because stockholders have enough skin in the game. Stock prices then might take a hit sometimes, but we kind of know something about what happens when stock prices take a hit, but it's the stockholders have enough to lose and firms don't go into bankruptcy. It would be like the dot-com bubble that burst. The dot-com bubble didn't have a ton of leverage because most people were just investing in the dot-com stocks with their own money that was not borrowed money. You know, that wasn't a nothing, but it was nothing like what we went through in 2008. Okay, so I think that's solvable, and I'm really delighted that I don't have to lead the charge on this. I really try hard to play a good supporting role, but Anat Admati is the go-to person on this. So I trust her a lot on this issue. She wrote The Banker's New Clothes with Martin Hellwig. I interact with her on Twitter. She's actually coming soon, I think. We don't know the exact date, but she might be, you might like to hear her talk. But if you're interested in this issue, you can take a look at The Banker's New Clothes, or in general, listen to Anat Admati. Okay, I'll talk about this only briefly. It turns out improving the U.S. trade balance is also not super hard. So here, if you click on key posts, you'll see my so I write for Quartz, which is a fairly new online business magazine that was started by the Atlantic Company a few years ago. And my 14th most popular Quartz column is how increasing retirement saving could give America more balanced trade. And remarkably, you might think, how do we get people, you know, basically, I go into this in length in my intermediate macro class, but if we borrow a lot from foreigners, we're also going to have a big trade deficit. And so, you know, if we saved more, we wouldn't be borrowing as much from foreigners. And the remarkable thing is, in all likelihood, it's not that hard to raise the saving rate, because there's some remarkable evidence from a friend of mine, David Leibson, and Bridget Madrian, whom I got on record in this column, that if you structure the 401ks so that people are automatically enrolled in them at a relatively high contribution rate, like 8%, a lot of people just say, hey, I'll leave that be. It's a bother to go and try to change it, and probably somebody knows what's good for me. As it is, it's like a lot of these have people contributing at 3%. I'm sorry, 3% saving out of your paycheck, that's not going to give you enough for your retirement. You know, unless your income is low enough that you're just going to be relying on Social Security anyway. 3% isn't going to cut it, and that's what a lot of these automatic enrollments do. So it's remarkably easy to improve the trade balance, and it's probably quite an ineffective way. It might work a little bit, but it's going to be fairly ineffective to try to do it by tariffs and you know, of course, what's under current discussion is kind of a tax break for exports and some extra taxes on imports. That's probably going to be much less effective than increasing the saving rate. And of course, you know, doing it with the tax incentive will get us in trouble with the World Trade Organization, where I think we could get away with increasing the saving rate without getting in trouble with the World Trade Organization. Okay, now we come to the tough thing, fostering long-run growth. So there, you know, I've given you a long list of problems that might sound pretty hard, but actually have, I think, there's a pretty good idea for a solution. This is tough. I'm not sure I know the answer, and but we should all, you know, a lot of economists should be thinking about. In general, I just want to tell you my thinking at least. In general, it's all about doing things better and better. And as I emphasized before, first of all, you can't just keep doing the same thing the same way. You know, improvement in technology is doing things in new ways that are better. But secondly, getting new, better ways in the same area probably isn't going to cut it either, because then we kind of solved that area. We kind of did that in agriculture. And then, you know, if we got better at making food in agriculture, that'd help us a little bit. But mostly we have plenty of food, lots of good stuff, you know, it's knowing which of the food is safe to eat without gaining weight, that's a different matter. But as far as getting the menu of food available, we're doing pretty well on that. And remarkably, in terms of manufactured goods, we're getting better and better. So we got to improve on some of the tough stuff we haven't been improving so much on, like building houses. If we could get better at building houses, that would help a lot. Okay. Okay, so the three themes that I mentioned a bit at the beginning, and so far this is pretty much all I've got. I wish I had more to tell you on fostering long-run growth, but let me tell you what I do have. Number one, allow creative destruction. 2, dismantle privileges standing in the way of growth. And 3, support science. And you know, it's good to talk about dismantling privileges, but people may not realize where the privileges that are most standing in the way of growth are. Let's talk first about allowing creative destruction. Okay, remember these Garmin street finders? Okay, that one is remarkable because, like, almost overnight, there was one year people had these Garmin street finders, and then the next year you got the apps on your iPhone, and it's like, what do I need this big Garmin thing that sticks on my windshield? Now, it's true that some people now have a holder. My son has a holder for his iPhone on his windshield, but you know, that's creative destruction. You know, having the app on the iPhone destroyed those Garmin street finders as an economic thing. Okay, and I mentioned my second point here is so we need some creative destruction, and we should be okay with that. The main thing here is being okay with creative destruction, not getting in its way. The U.S. did a good job of not getting in the way of the transformation of retail. Many other countries did get in the way of the transformation of retail, and they paid the price in lower growth rates. So whatever problems the U.S. has, look, there are lots of problems in other advanced countries too. So you know, if you're okay just doing better than other countries, that's a different matter. But I want us to do well in absolute terms. Okay, to me, the biggest and most obvious hope here for transforming a big sector of the economy is self-driving cars. If you can really, who knows whether this will work in the next 10 years or not. There are people making bets on both sides for sure. But if we can get there, that's pretty wonderful. You don't need to own a car because you can have the robo-taxi. It's the end of parental chauffeuring. Think of how many hours parents spend getting their kids to the different practices and stuff. That's a huge freed up time, making people better off. And one of the things that the experts have emphasized is it frees up a lot of parking places too, because if you have a lot of these robo-taxis, I mean, they can, when they need to park, they can park way outside of town, but in the expensive areas in town, they don't need those parking spaces. So you've freed up actually a lot of urban real estate. Maybe we can do something with that. So that's a big deal. Okay, the general, I said basically we got to allow creative destruction. Another way of describing that is don't strangle new ways of doing things in the crib. Try to be tolerant of new ways of doing things. One example of where we did it right, I think, is we were slow to tax the internet. Now, that might even seem unfair, but I think it was probably the right decision. It's, I think the infant industry argument for having tariffs isn't such a great argument there, but the infant industry argument of, maybe letting the brand new ways of doing things have a little lower tax burden at the beginning. Now, let me be clear that the internet has grown up now. You see the brick and mortar stores, certainly like the bookstores disappearing and everything. So it's probably time to have folks on the internet pay sales taxes, but I think it was a good thing that we let them get away with not doing that for a while it was growing up. Uber and Airbnb, to me, I think they're doing great things. You know, even as a child, I gotta say, I thought taxis and hotels were ridiculously overpriced. Like, why is this hotel so expensive? And guess what? You know, you allow people to rent out pieces of their home, and hotels aren't that expensive anymore. I've had a great experience with Airbnb, and I've enjoyed Uber too. Now here, again, there's a bit of controversy, but you know, the U.S. has done better at this than other countries. There are other countries that are blocking Uber more, and there are some cities in the United States that are. What's the controversy? People say it's unfair that they escape the rules, but you got to realize some of those rules were bad rules in the first place. Half of the rules were just restraints of trade operating through government, and having newbies escape the rules for a while is the most plausible path to better rules. In other words, you know, if you say, oh, it's unfair because they don't keep all the rules, well, make the rules easier on everybody, okay? Now, I say this is the most plausible path. There are other paths that would be tougher. I mean, I use the phrase restraint of trade knowingly. That's a phrase from antitrust enforcement where we talk about monopolies and everything. I think would be a very interesting idea to apply antitrust rules to state and local governments. That's a fairly radical idea, but there are an awful lot of monopolies that are run by government, and a lot of them run by state and local government. And I don't know, why should we think a private monopoly is terrible and a state-run monopoly is okay? I mean, you know, if they were doing it for the benefit of the taxpayers, fine, but that's not what most of these are. These are the people in the businesses run to the government and say, hey, protect me from my competition, okay? And you may not realize this is happening, but it's very, very common. And by the way, it's probably going to happen, things are probably going to get worse before they get better for a very simple reason. I mean, I love all the news on the internet, but you know, all the free news on the internet means there's less money running through traditional newspapers, and one of the things that suffered has been state and local reporting. So national reporting has still done fine, but the state and local reporting and rooting out all the bits of corruption in state and local government, there's fewer reporters going after that now. I think ultimately philanthropy will have to take care of supporting a lot of that state and local reporting, but there, you know, and some of that's happening already. But anyway, it's not like state and local governments are lily white. No. We hear a lot more about the national government doing bad stuff, but state and local governments do lots of bad stuff. You just have to dig into it. Okay, dismantling privilege. And again, here you might want to shoot me, yeah, but here's, but you know, it's all nice. You know, people like to say, oh, the 1%ers, they're doing these terrible things. But I want to look into our own souls a little bit more. Most of you in this room are in a fairly privileged class here. So let's talk about privileges that are getting in the way of economic growth. Now, I've got to say the common intuition is you want to, you know, we say people's wages should go up. People's, you know, standards of living, their wages relative to prices. And so they say, well, let's try to raise people's wages. You know, you have movements for minimum wages and living wages and so on. What's a little bit more consonant with the way economic growth happens, in my view, is that you raise real wages by making one thing after another cheaper. And sometimes you can make things cheaper just by, you know, regular technology, but another way to make things cheaper is by taking away inappropriate privileges. Let me give some examples. Don't let the financial industry make money off of an implicit government guarantee. Have high capital requirements. We talked about that already. Don't let firms deceive people, even if they have the truth in the fine print. You can have better quality goods if you don't let companies deceive people. You know, sometimes people say, oh, the free market should mean that we let companies deceive people. No, we've got some theorems about this. In order to have the theorems that the free market does good things, you got to have people telling the truth. The theorems don't go through otherwise in terms of the free market always making everything better. So insisting that people tell the truth is a pro-free market thing. Here's another one that might sound controversial, but you know, we have, with the internet and everything, things are very dynamic, and people can create wonderful things if they can combine old things in new ways. And copyright has started to get in the way. So basically, you know, if you say when do you make the money from the book? Most of the money you make from a book is in the first 7 years. Actually, I'll tell you a specific statistic. You know, Quartz is a magazine, so it's a little different than a book, but they make such a big fraction of their money in the first 1 month of an article being out there that they were happy to give me back the copyright after 1 month. So they make their money in the first month, and then I can put the Quartz articles on my blog after a month. So for magazines, the first month is enough to make the money. For books, I'm arguing something like the first 7 years. I think that would make for a more dynamic economy in terms of things that are written. Okay, I'll have whole slides on this. Allow people who need jobs to work and make things cheaper by loosening occupational licensing, and make sure there's all the housing anyone could want within a quick bus ride of where the jobs are by allowing a high district. Again, a little bit controversial. So occupational licensing I'll talk about first. It's good to know that occupational licensing reform is now bipartisan. One of the wonderful things that the Obama administration did was to have an initiative on, they call it, new steps to reduce unnecessary occupation licenses that are limiting worker mobility and reducing wages. And you can see up at the top, it says the White House President Barack Obama. This is not a current website, it's from back in time. But, okay, I'll put this back. Okay, I'm not a current website, I'm back in time. So, you know, there's been this growth of restrictions on doing particular jobs. You know, there are states in which you have to have a license to be a flower arranger, for example. You know, I think there's more than one state where you have to have a license to paint people's fingernails. And of course, this makes it hard for people at the bottom end to find jobs. So, you know, to have the government say you may not have a job because only somebody who goes and gets, you know, 2 years worth of training is, or a year and a half worth of training is allowed to cut hair or something. That's something we don't need to do to the people who are struggling at the bottom. And you know, you can also, it raises the prices of things if you force people to get way more training than is truly necessary for something. Now, let me make one simple point. It's really licensing that's the problem. There's all the difference in the world between certification and licensing, and I don't know if people understand this. Certification is basically the government being in charge of labels so that people know what they're getting. It's totally fine to say, look, if you want to call yourself a barber, you need a year and a half worth of training. So people know if they've got a barber, they've got somebody who's very well trained. But then you need to have another category, let's call it hair cutter, that needs 2 weeks of training, right? So then people will know if I want somebody very highly trained, I need to go to somebody who calls themselves a barber, and I'm fine if somebody's thrown in jail or fined for calling themselves a barber when they're not. But you need to have this category of the hair cutter over here with 2 weeks of training who's allowed to go out and cut hair and make a living without training beyond what's absolutely necessary. Okay, let me give some examples of where this can make a big difference to cost. So this first one is about doctors. So my friend Helen Levy was on the Council of Economic Advisors, and her portfolio her job within there was to think about healthcare and Obamacare. And one of the things that the folks in the Obama administration really hoped Obamacare would do would be to basically, because the states are more on the hook for helping people get enough health care, that the states would have the incentive to allow nurses to do more things. Nurses are very capable people. They can do a lot of stuff. There's also people in the same kind of category, physician's assistants, and they're called in general mid-levels. There's a simple rule for keeping health costs down. Doctors should never do anything a nurse or a technician can do, nor should they get a big cut of what a nurse or technician can do on her or his own. You don't want to say, if you don't need that supervision, you don't want the doctor, you don't want a requirement that the doctor has to supervise them if they don't need supervision, and then the doctor is taking a big cut of their wages for supervising them when the doctor is really doing very little. And notice, this can help more and more in the future because we do have technological progress, and progress in diagnosis enables precision medicine where it's there are more and more conditions where it's crystal clear what treatment to do. So there's a nice book called The Innovator's Prescription by my friend Clay Christensen and some two co-authors. And they say, this is the thing they map out, is if you can get really good at diagnosing things, so you can do precision medicine, and then you can have technicians and mid-level people actually doing the things in all the easy cases, then you can save the doctors who have many, many years of training for the tough cases. Yeah, you got a doctor house kind of problem, you need a doctor. You need a doctor for the tough cases, but save the doctors for the tough cases and let the nurses and the other mid-levels and the technicians take on the easy cases, and let's hope that technology makes for more and more easy cases. Now, this has been happening some, but we should push it forward even more. Similar principles. Lawyers should never do anything a paralegal can do, nor should lawyers get a big cut of the pay from what a paralegal can do on her or his own. A paralegal should be able to set up shop on their own for limited things, for certain categories of things, not for the hard things, but for the relatively straightforward things. Dentists should never do anything a dental hygienist can do, nor get a big cut of what a dental hygienist can do on her or his own. And by the way, there are states that do it just this way and other states that don't. This is a thing where states differ. A lot of the big issues, you know, people talk about regulation. I'm telling you, the big issues in regulation are not at the national level. The big issues in regulation are at the state and local level. And these are some of the big ones. You know, if a dental hygienist can set up shop on his own, you can get dental care done more cheaply. Now, they might want to be next door to a dentist, and they can refer you to the dentist when need be, but the dentist shouldn't necessarily be getting such a big cut of what the dental hygienist should be earning. I talked already, highly trained barbers should never do anything a hair cutter with 2 weeks of training could do, nor get a big cut of what a hair cutter with 2 weeks of training could do on her or his own. And then, you know, you might say, where do all these occupational licenses come from? Well, I had a ringside seat. In the state of Michigan, my massage therapist was the head of one of the state associations, and they paid for a lobbyist to go up to Lansing in Michigan to lobby for licensing here. And, you you got to be honest. I mean, the point was they wanted to have it all be high quality. But again, there's all the difference in the world between certification and licensing. I have no problem whatsoever saying you can't call yourself a massage therapist unless you've had a year of schooling and you can do a really good job. But then you need to have another category, you know, I don't know, body work or whatever you want to call them, where you don't need much training at all. Okay, you need a little bit of safety training, and okay, you gotta, here are the rules, you can't, there are certain things you can't do. Fine, 2 weeks worth of training, and then set them out to do their jobs. You need that low category. You need that low category that doesn't take much training. Everybody will know because the government regulates the label that that's low quality, but it lets people get a job. It's like, okay, do I want high quality and pay genuine money, or do I want low quality and, pay less? And it matters because some people's income isn't quite so high, and it's not so easy for them to pay for the high quality thing all the time, and maybe they'd rather have a lower quality thing than nothing. Let's turn the spotlight on ourselves. We can't be hypocrites here. What about colleges and universities? Well, the first thing I would say is college degrees need to be more about real learning than they are. And look, in terms of teaching, they mostly, still to this day, and I hope I'm not revealing too much, they mostly just throw us in and see if we can swim in terms of teaching, And the trouble is, but it's not for a lack of wanting to help professors learn how to teach, but a lot of it's about the science of teaching and learning having been undeveloped. It's not like until very recently that we've known how to do learning. There's actually a wonderful book about learning called Make It Stick, and this is actually by some psychologists. And there's some things we're starting to know, like engaging students by using clickers during class is going to help them learn. And I emphasize to my class that trying to remember stuff before you look back at the chapter is going to be really helpful. So so we first need to know how to do that. We need to know the best science about learning, and we'll talk more about the science in a minute. But we also need to care more about real learning. Let me say, I don't want us to have a monopoly on the ability to give people a credential. We should not have that monopoly. That's not appropriate. We have the name, so it's like, we're like the high quality category, and we should be high quality. But I want to argue that any clear demonstration of equivalent learning by a student who is aided in learning by another institution, accredited or not, should be treated the same as a college degree. You should have, it's tough though, it's tough to have a test rigorous enough to say, hey, you've learned as much as a college degree. And we kind of do that for high school with the GEDs, but there's some evidence that the GEDs aren't really the equivalent of a high school diploma, that people aren't as capable who have a GED as who have a high school diploma. So it's a tough thing, but if there were a way to provide evidence, and I think computerized tests may get better and help us to do this. Now, one thing I've written about on courts is arguing this, that the best hope for lowering, a lot of students come away from college with a lot of debt. What do I think is the hope for that overall? The best hope for lowering the cost of a college education is to really raise the quality of community college education. I mean, that's already fairly inexpensive. We could, you might do a little bit more to help people afford community college educations, especially if it's tough, if they need to work less, fewer hours while they're in school. But they're already fairly inexpensive. And I think by using computer-aided instruction and having the teachers and the professors be like coaches for the students, I think we can get inexpensive, very high-quality education at the community college levels. Now, let me say, I'm not worried that the University of Colorado Boulder is going to have a huge problem if this happens, because there are a lot of other aspects that make it very attractive to be a student here. I mean, we offer many unique features, but I hope that community colleges get so much better at the instructional part, at the in-course instructional part of things, that they give us a run for our money, and then hopefully we'll improve our instruction. But we also have just many other cool things. You've got the football team, and you've got the clubs, and you've got the networking and everything. So and you get to, if you want to, you get to rub shoulders with the faculty. And I wish my students would come visit me in office hours more. But all right. So now on to that issue of housing. Remember, that was 40% of the household budget. This is a big deal if you can make housing cheaper. And there are two costs to housing. One is the house on top of the land. One is the cost of the land underneath. And so, you know, yes, we need to get better at construction, but we also need to make it so that the cost of the land underneath isn't going to hurt you so much. And to me, you know, there's a lot of great things about cities. I mean, there are a lot of great jobs in cities, and many economists believe that this is because you put people in cities, they interact with one another a lot. That's just very productive. So we want to have dense cities, and you know, a lot of the cities that are attractive because they have jobs, though, are now too expensive for people to move into. And I think the way to have density and still allow extra units to be there is to build up. And you know, I've moderated a little bit since a few months ago. You don't have to let people build up everywhere. What I argue, and you can see it in the title over here, I think every city needs to have a high district. Every city needs a place where you let people build up to the skies so that people can have affordable housing within a quick bus ride of the jobs. Okay? You can have places where there's rules that you have to have low housing, and those houses will still be expensive. But you need to have some inexpensive housing, and if you build up, then there's a limit of how much the land prices are going to add to the cost of things. You know, it's still, and you know, there's the extra cost of building. You know, you still have to build the building, but maybe we can get better at construction too. And in this blog post, Density is Destiny, I play amateur architect. So if you want, you can see what I do as amateur architect. But one thing I discovered when I started talking about this was on Facebook there was a market urbanism group that seems to have very interesting discussions about these issues. But I think this is a big, big deal. In fact, boy, you know, this is off in the future, but you know, things like occupational licensing, and especially these issues of land use, I would love to have a think tank here at the University of Colorado Boulder. I think this is a good place to do it. I think these are inherently difficult issues because there are many, many legitimate reasons to have rules about land use. You can't just have a free-for-all, but you got to separate the people just trying to avoid, you know, keep out the competitors from the legitimate land use rules. Let me actually tell you one bit of logic. Here's a bit of logic that should be ideally in every principles of economics class. It's a beautiful example of externalities and political economy. Okay, so it's a tough question. How many houses, how many buildings and apartments and stuff you should allow to be built in a city. But one thing I'm pretty confident of by a simple analysis is that the local government will want too few. Why? For a very simple reason. If they're worried about their voters, they're not including the benefit to people who don't now live in the city, who might want to live in the city. Those are Americans too. Their welfare counts. The people who want to move here and who would just enjoy. I love it here. I love it that I've been able to move here. And you know, yeah, I'm lucky that you know, the department pays me relatively well so that I can, you know, I can afford a house here. But imagine my income weren't quite as high. I could be shut out of living in this wonderful place because there aren't places for me to live that are affordable. That's just cruel. To say that people can't live in Boulder. I know this is really controversial around here, and there are people who said, we don't want more jobs here because that'll bring more people. Well, that's just not kind. Okay, final point, support science. You know, science is a small part of the overall federal budget, but has very high impact. I think it's surprising, you know, science, politicians don't speak too much against science. Occasionally they do, but mostly they don't speak against it. But I find it surprising that politicians don't seize the opportunity to multiply science funding tenfold. Better science will ultimately help get almost everything that voters want. Okay, I mean, you might have heard that education is the magic bullet, but I just argued and I'll have it on the next slide, to do better education, we need better science about what works in education. So you can't have better education without better science, not beyond a certain point. So, you know, list almost anything voters want, better science is likely to help. Even having our enemies not do us in. You know, you have better engineers, you make better weapons, and then our enemies don't get us, you know. So it's going to be hard for you to think of something the voters want that better, you know, science isn't going to help people get. Somehow the benefits of science must be hard for politicians to communicate. I don't understand why they don't go for big amounts of science, because it's not like we're busting the budget with science. We're just not. Now, there are problems if you have the funding low. Now, it's pretty obvious you'll get less science funded, so less will happen. But it's worse than that. It's worse than that, because when government funding is low, only safe science projects get funded. So I've been involved in getting grants, and here's the way it works. One negative review by a primary reviewer is enough to prevent a project from getting funded, because you have to be like in the top 9%, you know, in the, so I apply for grants from the National Institute on Aging, and there you got to be in the top 9%. So you got to be in, you know, the best out of 11 projects. And you know, the lore there is if you get one negative review, you're probably done for. Well, what does that mean? Suppose you have an out-of-the-box idea that's kind of high risk but high return if it works. You might even have somebody give you a fabulous review. But if you get that one negative review too, because it's a high-risk project, you're done for. You're done for. The only way we get the really creative things, I mean, sometimes a creative thing also looks safe enough it can get through, but there are a lot of creative things that you get funded if you had more funding. Okay, listen, this slide, I don't know very much about physical science and technology. This is just stuff I've heard, so I'll mostly scope over this. But there's cool stuff going on in solar power. Just, it's getting a lot cheaper. And the trend lines are pretty good. So this Ramez Nam claims that somewhere around 2020, it's going to get cheaper than other things. And I heard a former U.S. Energy Secretary, when I went to a conference in Qatar on the Persian Gulf a couple years ago, say, you know, a lot of the cost now is installation rather than the solar panels themselves. But the Germans have gotten, they subsidize solar power so much, the Germans have gotten very good at installation despite being a relatively cloudy country. So there's a lot of hope there for solar power. You know, there's the issue of storing things in terms of, you know, battery power or something. So you might need something at night. You know, nuclear power has a very bad reaction, but you know, when I talked about this a little bit online, somebody said, look, there are these new reactors that just operate on different principles, liquid fluoride thorium reactors that are much, much, much safer. So we shouldn't lump all of nuclear power together. One thing that's super exciting is high temperature superconductors. It isn't just that we could, you know, have power lines without power loss. We could have fabulous toys if we had room temperature superconductors. Now, mining the asteroids may seem out there, but people are starting to, there's, you know, the government has made laws about rights for asteroids now. It's kind of interesting. The thing about asteroids is there are kind of three types of asteroids. They're hunks of ice, there's hunks of rock, and then there's hunks of metal. Now, why would that be? I'm just guessing, but I think what happened was, you know, a lot of the asteroid, you know, in the early solar systems, things banged into one another, and sometimes you had something kind of biggish where the metal sank to the center, and then it got smashed apart, and so the metal in the core is now floating out there. And some of these are near-Earth asteroids, so you know, there's some valuable metal out there if we can figure out how to get it to Earth. You know, you have a mile by a mile by a mile, and if it's a hunk of metal, that's a lot. Okay, that's all I should say. Probably more than I should have said on that. But I actually know a bit more about the biological sciences than I do about the physical sciences at this point. I mentioned that excellent diagnosis can lead to precision medicine that can be much, much cheaper if we also let nurses and technicians do things rather than the very expensive doctors, save the expensive doctors for the really hard stuff. But I want to return to this issue of the rise of obesity. I really think the rise of obesity is a first-class scientific mystery, and I want to urge you to be skeptical of people who think they know the answer, because, you know, if we knew the answer, we'd be able to stop it, right? If we don't know, if we can't stop this rise of obesity, we don't understand it yet, not at the level we need to understand it, and we certainly haven't stopped it. Okay, and interestingly enough, economists are and in the future should be involved in attempting to solve this mystery. So you know, and it's not like everything in the book is necessarily true, but I found the book, The Case Against Sugar, very intriguing. And when I was in the middle of reading it, I sent an email to my friend Joshua Hausman, who's a very good economic historian, one who the University of Colorado Boulder has recruited before, and I hope will recruit again in the future. And I said, you know, tools of economic history would be really helpful in figuring out how bad sugar is in terms of obesity. Why do you need economic history? Guess what? You have to go back a ways in time to get back to a time before sugar, or to a time before people were eating a lot of sugar. And so you need those tools of economic history. So, you know, economic historians are experts at working with, you know, low quality data on first-class questions. And this is actually one of the strengths of the University of Colorado Boulder. So the thing that I've just been talking to you know, my friend Dan Benjamin, who's works with me on the economics of happiness, which I'll talk about in a minute, is also heavy into genetic work. And so, so I've been talking to him and his other coworkers about getting involved in genetic things. And here's the thing that I'm excited about being involved in. They've already kind of identified the genes that are associated with obesity, but that doesn't tell you enough. What I'd like to do, and I think it's doable, and if it isn't doable with, you know, a sample of 70,000 people, it'll be doable when you have a sample of 700,000 people, which hopefully you can someday get. But instead of just identifying genes related to obesity, let's separate those genes into two piles: those genes that interact strongly with the social environment and those that don't. Okay? And, you know, I mean, I went to a conference on polygenic prediction just the other day, and there's a nice example of how the social matters a lot. So this is unusual. Usually there are lots of little genes that matter. But for cigarette smoking, there's one big gene that matters. And what does this gene do? It adds a lot to addiction. If somebody never tries a cigarette in their life, it doesn't matter that they have the tobacco addiction gene. They won't die from smoking. They won't smoke any more than somebody who didn't try smoking, who didn't have the gene. But if they, you know, smoke 100 cigarettes, and they have that addiction gene, it's going to be much tougher for them to quit. Actually, there's some hope, because with a, you know, this is unusual, but that specific gene is has been mapped. They figured out what to do with it. There is a drug that can, for people who have that gene, it raises the chances of quitting from 15% to 30%. So, you know, if you're having trouble quitting, you know, you can get tested for this gene. You can try that drug, but that's a gene-environment interaction. That gene, if there weren't cigarettes in the world, that gene wouldn't make much difference in your life. Another simple example is there's a gene among people of Asian descent that makes your face flush and make it unpleasant if you have alcohol. So these folks live longer who can't tolerate alcohol. So that's a gene that it's like about the it's the biggest gene for heart disease in those populations, but it operates through the social means of preventing you from drinking alcohol because you can't tolerate it, even in the short run. Okay, so interesting stuff, and stuff that economists are getting involved in, as well as people from many other disciplines. You know, once we've identified, you know, if we sort of identify the genes that are particularly related to these gene-environment interactions, maybe we'll figure out what aspects of the environment are the most problem. Okay, going to social sciences proper, I think this kind of science can help us a lot in improving things. It isn't just the physical sciences and the biological sciences. And I think one of the biggest questions to answer in order to improve our country and raise the economic growth rate is to figure out what works best for learning. And this is something that economists are involved in. So so one of the people who's as new as I am is Rick Mansfield. So this is something, he and his co-author have a technique for seeing what works in schools that kind of corrects for some of the statistical issues. So that's cool. Then a couple months ago, we have a seminar and we have people come visit. So Kartik Muralidharan came and talked to us. Just to give you an example of the kind of research that economists are involved in, let me give you this summary I put on my blog of his paper and his talk on disrupting education, experimental evidence on technology-aided instruction in India. And you get good lessons. Number one, hardware by itself contributes very little to learning. There's a huge state in India, bigger than most of the countries in the world, where the campaign was, we will give a laptop to every child. Sorry? Giving hardware alone doesn't make people learn, okay? Maybe they do other things with their hardware than learning. Secondly, teaching software, you might think, oh, let's have software that complements classroom instruction. Sorry, doesn't work very well. Why? Because most of the Indian kids are way behind grade level. And the trouble with software that's at the same level as the class instruction is it's way over the kids' heads. They go into the class, it's over their heads. Then they go to the computer, that's over their heads too. That's not going to help. What does work, and this is where evidence matters to realize this, teaching software that's designed to find the level of the student and teach at that level. Now, it's advancing them from a level, 4 years past grade level up to 3 years. 4 years below grade level to 3 years below grade level, but that's learning. That's learning and that counts. And so I think that's really cool. Just to understand that. I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense when you discover it, but hey, there are a lot of people who thought hardware might work. There were a lot of people who thought, hey, make it dovetail with the classroom instruction. That'll do good things. Sorry, maybe in an environment where people were at grade level, but not here. Okay, I've been interested in, there are other things that research has shown about education, and one of the remarkable things that was behind, this is by far the most popular quartz column I've ever written, and I wrote it with Noah Smith. This one went viral. There's one key difference between kids who excel at math and those who don't, and it had another title of something about math person, but basically people think they're math people or not math people. No, that's not the way it works. You're not born a math person or not. It's how much time you spend with math. If you spend a lot of time with math, you'll get good at it. And guess what? Math is hard. Math is hard for everyone. I got a reputation as being a pretty good mathematician, but if I look back and I count up the number of hours I spent just tinkering around with math. Now, in this article, I said, yeah, what happens is, if you love math, you spend a lot of time with it, and then you get good at it. Now, what if you don't love math? Oh, your road is a little bit harder. You got to act the same as if you loved math, namely spend a lot of time with it, even though you don't love it. Now, hopefully you come to love it, but if you don't ever love it, it's going to be, less pleasant. But if you spend as much time on math as if you loved math, you will get very good at math in the end. Okay, it's a very simple model. Effort's a big part of it. Yeah, genes may matter some, but honestly, the twin studies don't suggest that genes are super big. Math doesn't run in families as much as you might think. So I dug into that a little bit in this one. But the point is, believing, so the psychologists, some of them from, psychologists did this wonderful experiment where they had two groups of students. One group of students, the placebo group, They just taught about memory. No big effects there. The other group, they said, you know what? If you work hard at studying, you can become smarter. And it's kind of my understanding they had pictures of the brain rewiring itself to make it dramatic and stuff. But anyway, they're saying you can get smarter if you study harder. Okay, so you can do it. And guess what? Those students were better students when they believed that they could be smarter than when they thought, hey, I'm just kind of dumb. I'm just not good at school. I'm not good at math. You know, if you think you can't, that's as good for a self-fulfilling prophecy as anything. Thinking you can't is a pretty good self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, there are things you might think you can do that you find you can't. You know, you decide to be if I decided to be an Olympic swimmer, I mean, I don't think it's going to work. I don't have the body type for one thing, and I'm sure there are other things you could decide wouldn't work there. But math is not that kind of thing. And you know, think of how we, just to bring you up short, if I can, what would you think if somebody said, you know, I'm just not a reader. I can't read. You know, there are readers and not readers. I'm just not a reader. No, we expect everybody in our society to try to learn to read. And we feel it a sad thing and feel sorry for people who are illiterate and try to help them out. We should feel that way about math because guess what? Math is pretty important for succeeding in the work world. It's super important. And by the way, you know, one of the things about economists is most of them are people who love math. So, you know, I argue here we ought to have a lot more math clubs. Well, economists are some people worth trying to talk into running a math club if you want to get that sort of a thing to happen. But people can do more math, and it'll help them in getting a job. Okay, this is the kind of the last thing I'm going to talk about before the final slide. I've been involved in research. I called it the economics of happiness, but let me, it's a little broader than that. So we're trying to develop the principles for building national well-being indices. So think of something alongside GDP. GDP has its purposes. For example, military power, total GDP, that's a pretty good measure. You know, even if you have a small GDP, even if everybody's really, really happy, you probably still can't fight off the bad guys. So GDP does have its place, but it's imperfect. Let me tell you some ways it's imperfect. Guess what? You know, there was this editorial in the Wall Street Journal that was saying, "Oh no, we can't have a carbon tax because that would lower economic growth." Wrong, wrong. Guess what? Maybe it would lower GDP, but it is economic growth if we improve the environment without making other stuff go down too much, right? Just because GDP doesn't have that in it, that's a failing of GDP. Are we better off if the environment is better? Yes. That's just a matter of our statistics. Yes, our statistics aren't perfect because we don't know exactly how much it's worth if the environment is better, but we know it's worth quite a bit. Okay, and environmental economists try to do a good job of pinning this down. You know, it's tough enough to pin down that the government has decided it doesn't want to mechanically include it in GDP, but you can get pretty good estimates. Second example, you know, I was complaining about the economic growth rate a while ago, but just imagine that per capita GDP had done exactly as well as it had, but we hadn't had any rise in obesity. That would be a much nicer America than the one we're in. People would be healthier, we'd probably have lower medical costs, and we'd be able to spend more money on other things. And guess what? There would be a lot of people's consciousness freed up that's now just thinking a lot about, oh, I got to lose weight and stuff. And guess what? The science isn't there to help them lose weight. Not very well, sorry. I mean, it's like maybe, you know, there's some promising things. There are good hypotheses. There's some things that seem to work for some people. But it's not like we've nailed it and gotten a consensus. Okay. So GDP doesn't have everything in it. Look, I don't care if it's in GDP or not. It's economic growth if we get for people more of what they want. If people get more of what they want, that is economic growth, okay? Because economics is not just about the things that we happen to buy and sell in the markets. Economics is about people getting what they want. That's kind of the job of economists is that we've taken on for ourselves, is to try to help people get more of what they want, trying to arrange things so that whatever it is that people want, people get more of it. And one of the nice things about economists is they're relatively non-judgmental. You know, you like tiddlywinks and you enjoy tiddlywinks, we're good with that. Okay? Okay, so turns out people want many things, and some of our research has involved, and here's some of the team here, but even happiness and life satisfaction, as those are measured on surveys, are only part of what people want. Right, okay, there are different meanings to the word happiness. You know, one meaning is just, is everything people want. That's not the way people use the word when you say, how happy are you? They talk about how happy you feel. As measured on surveys, happiness and life satisfaction are only part of what people want. Our team and the team working on this now is Dan Benjamin, Kristen Cooper, Ori Heffetz, and I, and then some wonderful research assistants. And these are at that wonderful point in life right between getting their bachelor's degree in economics and going on to get a PhD in economics. So that's it's really fun working with the research assistants. We're looking at more than 2,000 what we call aspects of well-being that people might desire. So, you know, there's the regular stuff like happiness and life satisfaction and meaning in life, but we've got things in there like your boss not yelling at you. Okay, so we want to know how important these different things are, and then we'll narrow down the list. And we've written a paper about all the problems and the obstacles we have to get over to make a national well-being index. So we'll work away at that. But I think that'll be very cool. I think if we'd had this kind of a national well-being index, I think there would have been more of an early warning sign of some of the discontent that we saw in the latest election. You know, some of it was there in the you know, income statistics and everything, but I think the discontent went beyond that, beyond what we could predict by looking at narrow economic statistics. But hey, these are all economic statistics in the broad sense. And we're also not just looking at well-being of the different people in this broad sense of people getting everything that they want, what economists often call utility. We're also looking at what's called the social choice problem of what to do if people's desires conflict. And so there are two approaches we're looking at. One is kind of the modern version of utilitarianism. But the other is kind of interesting. You can see it as a one-person, one multifaceted vote approach. But social choice, you know, how you make decisions when people disagree is actually a part of economics too, and it's something that some very famous economists have worked on, like Ken Arrow, who I think recently passed away. Okay, so this is just the final slide, really, the three themes for fostering long-run growth, and I wish I had more answers than this, but this is all I've got. Allow creative destruction, dismantle privilege standing in the way of growth, and support science. And don't forget that there are several easier problems I talked about, but on the hard problems, this is what I've got. Thank you so much for coming. This has been great.